Most cities are built in places that make logical sense: a natural harbor, a defensible hill. Chicago was built in a freezing, disease-ridden mudflat named after a foul-smelling vegetable, and the story of how it survived is essentially a century-long war against the laws of physics. To understand Chicago, you have to understand that the very ground it sits on was a geographical mistake. The area was originally inhabited by the Miami and Illinois peoples, who had a word for the region: Chica-Aqua. It translates literally to stinky onion or wild garlic. This wasn't a cute metaphor. The area around the Chicago River was quite literally a sprawling, flat, waterlogged swamp heavily populated by a species of wild leek known to botanists as Allium tricoccum. The smell was distinct, highly aggressive, and not exactly screaming future site of a global financial hub. When French explorers Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet paddled through in 1673, they realized this miserable, reeking mud pit had one redeeming quality. It sat exactly on a subcontinental divide. Water on one side flowed east to the Great Lakes. Water on the other side flowed west to the Mississippi. If you wanted to move goods across the continent without lugging them over the Rocky Mountains, this stinky little portage was the choke point. Chicago is what happens when extreme logistical convenience perfectly overlaps with a completely uninhabitable environment. The city's entire subsequent history is just residents obstinately refusing to let nature have the last word. The first non-indigenous person to look at this swamp and think, "Ah yes, prime real estate," was a man named Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. He was of African descent, likely born in Haiti, and in the 1780s he set up a highly successful trading post right at the mouth of the river. Du Sable was wealthy, educated, married to a Potawatomi woman named Kitihawa, and essentially ran the entire local economy from his front porch. He had a mill, a dairy, a smokehouse, and a barn. But because history is written by people who are terrible at sharing credit, for over a century, Chicago's civic boosters preferred to pretend the city was founded by a white guy named John Kinsey, who bought Du Sable's property in 1800. Kinsey is famous for two things: claiming he founded Chicago and murdering a rival trader and fleeing to Milwaukee. Historians have argued about Kinsey for decades, which tells you everything about historians, but today Du Sable is finally recognized as the true founder. Though you have to wonder if during those deep freeze winters where the wind comes off Lake Michigan like a physical assault, Du Sable ever missed the Caribbean. By the 1830s, Chicago was officially a town, but it had a fundamental, terrifying flaw. The elevation of Chicago was only about 2 feet above the level of Lake Michigan, which meant the city couldn't drain. Imagine a bustling pioneer metropolis of thousands of people, horses, and livestock, where nothing washes away, ever. When it rained, the streets didn't just get muddy, they dissolved. Carriages sank to the axles. There were literal signs placed in the street mud reading "shortest route to China," and that was just the surface. Underneath, there was no sewage system because water doesn't flow uphill. The human waste, the animal waste, the garbage, it all just sat in stagnant, pathogenic pools. Unsurprisingly, this led to massive, devastating outbreaks of cholera and dysentery. The city was basically marinating in its own filth. By 1855, the mortality rate was catastrophic. The city engineers realized they needed a sewer system. But to have a sewer system, you need gravity. And to have gravity, you need a hill. Chicago had no hills, so the city council, in a move of pure, unadulterated hubris, decided that if they didn't have a hill, they would simply lift the entire city into the sky. This is not a metaphor. In the 1850s and 60s, Chicago initiated the single most audacious engineering project of the 19th century. They raised the grade of the city by 4 to 14 feet. How do you lift a masonry building? You dig under it, put down enormous wooden beams, slide hundreds of heavy metal jackscrews underneath, and then you hire hundreds of men to stand in the mud. On a signal, every man turns his screw 1/4 turn. The building goes up a fraction of an inch. Repeat until the building is 10 feet in the air. Then you build a new brick foundation underneath it, and boom, your ground floor is now a basement. They did this to entire blocks at once. In 1860, they lifted an entire row of brick buildings on Lake Street, an entire city block, almost an acre in size, weighing an estimated 35,000 tons. It took 600 men turning 6,000 jackscrews, and the most insane part? They didn't even close the businesses inside. You could literally be shopping for a hat on the ground floor, step outside, and realize the street was now 4 feet below you. Wooden buildings that weren't worth lifting were simply put on logs and rolled to the suburbs. Traffic in Chicago routinely included entire multi-story houses rolling down the avenue while families were still inside eating dinner. The sheer, obstinate refusal to accept geography is the defining trait of a Chicagoan, but engineering can only protect you so much. The wooden structures, the packed grid, and the booming industrial growth created a tinderbox. And in October 1871, that tinderbox met a dry autumn wind. The Great Chicago Fire destroyed over 3 square miles of the city, left 100,000 people homeless, and took roughly 300 lives. It was an apocalyptic tragedy, and no, a cow did not start it. The myth of Mrs. O'Leary's cow was manufactured by a newspaper reporter who later admitted he made it up because it sounded better than "we don't actually know." The O'Learys were Irish immigrants, and the press was more than happy to scapegoat an anti-immigrant stereotype rather than blame the city's dangerously unregulated timber construction. The fire wiped the slate clean. But rather than abandon the swamp, the city used the disaster to reinvent itself, giving birth to the modern steel-frame skyscraper. They built upward, but they still had a problem with the water. By the late 19th century, the city was booming. The stockyards were slaughtering 400 million animals, dumping the waste into a tributary so thick with decaying matter it was literally called Bubbly Creek. Because of the subcontinental divide we talked about earlier, all of this horrific filth flowed east, directly into Lake Michigan, which also happened to be the city's drinking water supply. So Chicago found itself drinking its own industrial waste. Most cities would move their water intake or perhaps filter their sewage. Chicago looked at the river and said, "What if we just make it go the other way?" In 1900, after moving over 42 million cubic yards of earth and rock, they completed the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. They cut a trench so deep that it broke the subcontinental divide. Water from Lake Michigan rushed in, and the Chicago River, which had flowed east since the last ice age, suddenly started flowing west, sending all of Chicago's waste down the Mississippi River toward St. Louis. St. Louis sued, obviously, but Chicago basically said, "Hey, water under the bridge," and won in the Supreme Court. From a stinky onion swamp to lifting itself out of the mud, surviving annihilation, and successfully weaponizing its own plumbing against the state of Missouri, Chicago is a monument to human willpower. It is a city that refuses to take no for an answer, especially when that no comes from Mother Nature herself. If you want to support the channel, hit subscribe. And if you're from St. Louis, I'm so sorry.